Good morning. My name is Christine Morton, and I'm from a company called Proxima. We are a procurement consultancy, and we are part of Bain & Company. I've been looking after contingent workforces since about 2005, when I got a project at the London Local Authority's Centre of Excellence, and they were spending £500 million on contingent labor, and they didn't know how many people that was, and they didn't know how long they'd been there, and they couldn't tell, really anything about this workforce. And so when I work with clients, I often take a procurement angle, so that's my background, but it's really important for me to look at the overall workforce planning, the HR side, and then legal and risk, things like IR35 and background screening, but also the overall process to make sure that everyone knows where they are in the system and how do you get access to talent as quickly as possible in the most reasonable fashion. So I had one question. There is one person in the audience I told this to already, but anyone guess how long the longest serving contingent worker I'd seen in practice had been? Any higher? 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 26 years. 26 years. 26 years as a contingent worker, and it really does pose questions about this workforce that can be longer than the average British marriage. So I will start again, like every American. Yes, I'm British as well, but like every American, I'm very excited to be here, and I'm going to talk to you initially about some of the macroeconomic trends that we're seeing here. Okay. So the first thing that we're seeing right now is that skills shortages are continuing. The REC is reporting that it's in accountancy and construction and teaching and nursing, and according to a recent report on Manpower, that 80% of employers are reporting talent shortages. Josh Burson, who is a really great researcher in this area, has said time to hire is increasing. I was at Parliament on Monday last week, and we had speakers from Royal Mail, and they said that their time to hire is about 67 days. It takes an awful long time to get talent in. So skills shortages are continuing, and you will see that bear out in your time to hire. It actually doesn't help that demographically we are looking at shrinking populations. And yes, whether you think Brexit was a good thing or a bad thing, last year we had some of the highest immigration into the UK on record. It was more than 600,000 people chose to make the UK their home. The second thing that you'll see is wage inflation. I'm sure this is no surprise to any of you. There is a cost of living crisis, and people are out there and looking for new jobs that have higher wages. So we know that the average permanent increase for this last year was around 5%, but the inflation is running between 8 and 10%, depending on the sources that you're looking at. The recent Reid report this week said that there was average salary across every sector has increased. So therefore, if you're in talent acquisition and contingent labor, you'll be seeing your fees, chances are, increase if you're dealing with on a percentage basis for calculating fees. Pending recession, there's this question of, are we in a recession? We know that there's an awful lot of cost of living challenges out there. What I see is that companies are commitment phobic, more than New York City bachelors on Sex in the City. So companies get commitment phobic on their permanent side, so that means that contingent labor will increase because they're not nervous about making really long-term commitments towards talent and roles. The other big thing that we see is that there's an increase in people looking for jobs. I assume this is no surprise to anyone, simply because there are cost of living pressures that are impacting on people. And so for the first time in 25 months, there's been an increase in the amount of people that are looking for jobs. Yesterday's news, they had the boss of Reed saying it's no longer a candidate-led market. I'm not sure he's correct. I still think that it will be a candidate-led market for some time because there is demographic pressures. There are actually going to be less people out there to do the do. So it's a classic demand and supply curve. I do believe you will be paying more for your permanent and your contingent labor. And the advice from Reed was increased wages wherever possible. You're in a competitive market for talent, and you need to make sure that you are differentiating your proposition. Does that relate to anybody? Everyone seeing the same type of things? Okay, so preaching to the choir then. So contingent workforce program trends that I am seeing. So I wasn't sure actually on reflection whether everyone knew what an MSP and a VMS is. Does everyone know? Some of you have them in the room. Okay, so an MSP is a very common tool that I see clients that spend over 20 million pounds or euros or even dollars use to create a single point of contact for their contingent labor programs. They manage the entire workforce under a single umbrella, and you can get VMS is the technology that supports that. They've been around for quite a long time now, and the question is like, are they really innovating at this point? And I would say actually many of them have been fairly stagnant. There's been some innovation in AI, but they're not moving as quickly as they can. Some of the VMSs are trying to dip their toe in the water of total talent management. Have anyone heard that term, total talent management? Right. What it means is looking at your workforce in a holistic fashion, and that's looking at your permanent and your contingent and even statement of work workforces under one vision to understand who the people are, what roles they're doing, what are they covering, and is that the right, asking the question of whether that's really right for our business. So I do see more direct sourcing being used, which is good because you can leverage your employee brand. And now if you're not using it, there is better benchmarking available. There are companies that will give you the price of workers, whether they're permanent or contingent, by the job role, by the level of experience, depending on what city in the world you want. And that can be proactively used for you to figure out what project, where you want to set up your next plant, your next, project that you want delivered. Where is the talent and how much is it going to cost me? The challenge on contingent labor is often that I see that it's mostly reactive. Okay, so I do see some movement towards total talent management transparency, but I do think that largely MSPs and VMSs have been kind of content. There's not been that much movement, and they could be more proactive. The next thing I wanted to say is that statement of work adoption within contingent programs is slow. You will see that the VMSs have built this fantastic technology and they can do this, and MSPs are willing to take that on. Statement of work, just for everyone who's aware, it's where you have a workforce that is aligned to the delivery of a deliverable. So I could be saying, I need a website built. I need 20 people to come do that, right? We're going to give them laptops in order to do that. But they are employed and everything by by the statement of work provider. Broadly speaking, they should be considered outside of your IR35 stuff. But it's really hard to implement statement of work workforces into your programs for contingent labor. You have tricky integrations. You don't know where it sits within your source to pay programs. Do I let the tech, people like hiring managers go out and negotiate contracts within the software for those deliverables? It gets tricky. Or do you just want headcount tracking so you know where all the laptops are and that they came back at the end of a program? So do you want somewhere in between? So I think the statement of workforce is really important because in my profession in procurement, forgive me for saying so, sometimes you see an awful lot of time and materials workforces which behave like contingent labor. And you will be paying through the nose for a former employer, Accenture, for a project manager when you could have gotten the same skills on the contingent market. So just think about what you're doing, how you're contracting, and do you need to track those people? IR35, I think we've all gotten to a really good, comfortable place. If you're not, please see me after or call me. IR35, we all know, for those that are inside IR35, we've put them on many umbrella company contracts, or we've made sure that they are being paid on a PAYE basis. For those that are outside IR35, they can continue, but you still, of course, in all cases, have to make sure that you're keeping records. I still see that we know what we're doing, but many companies think that was a one and done exercise. We don't need to think about it. Yes, you still do. some people are getting around it with varying degrees of success within their companies. And, you need to be aware because it still is a major risk point. HMRC is going after people and companies to look for compliance. And I would say with the big names, and I say this, as someone who's worked in a financial service institution where they do come and they do ask these questions, do you know who these people are? What kind of contracts? Have you audited? To see that all the way down the supply chain that tax has been applied. And the last thing I wanted to say on that bit was total talent management. It's still the holy grail, right? It is this vision of what is your entire workforce that you need to support your business strategy. But there's silos that still continue. Procurement is over here. HR is over here. We aren't thinking about how much one workforce piece costs versus another. And I say this, like years ago, I had a head of HR say, well, we've raised the pay for these types of workers to £36,000 a year. I said, that won't make any difference at all. And he looked at me like I was crazy. I said, well, your contingent workers are making £500 a day. And that's about £100,000 a year. If they need to leave, they can leave with 1 week notice. What would you do? And he'd never considered the question because people think about their permanent workforces and they don't think about the contingent workforces that they've built. And that is why in some areas, in IT, in social care, you actually have a greater amount of contingent workers because they're out of balance with the permanent workforce, the option. So there's still pressure on costs because it does look like a very high ticket item when you're looking at a spend cube. Oh, contingent labor, we're spending hundreds of millions of pounds on this kind of thing. Yes, you are. The bulk of that is wages and employer legislative on costs and holiday pay and things like that. Right. So the smartest companies. What are the smartest companies doing? So let's do some hands up exercises to see everybody. First thing in the morning, talent pooling. On your permanent workforce, I want you to raise your hand if you're doing any of these kinds of things on your permanent workforce. Ready? Alumni programs. Anyone looking at alumni? Good. Diversity and inclusion campaigns. Excellent. Career break returners. Also good. Good job, people. This is good. 50 plus, the latest group of people that are leaving. Any stuff going on there? Okay. Disability. Any disability? Oh, excellent. And neurodiversity. Excellent. And how many of you are working with your contingent providers for those same things? Okay. You have an opportunity here to look at your contingent workforce with that same lens and increase those profiles from a talent pooling perspective, making sure that you have people who are interested and ready and keen to work for your brand. But you can also look at all those other areas and target recruitment campaigns. And I would suggest that it would be a very sensible activity to do so. I had an employer once where they looked at their entire employees, their alumni, and realized actually people would want to come back to them, but maybe they don't want a permanent role. Maybe they do want a contingent program. Why aren't we investing in allowing those people to join the alumni program? It doesn't cost you very much, but it gets access to talent in a skills short market is really, really good. Next thing, agile review of processes for candidates. So how many of you have actually applied for a job recently at your own company under a fake name? Yeah. Okay. It can get clunky. People, if you're not looking at an agile user journey review and seeing what is happening at every single stage, your speed is paramount to finding the right talent. So if hiring managers are struggling to engage talent acquisition, guess what? Your contingent labor spend goes up. If it takes too long to apply, your candidates drop out. Guess what? Contingent labor spend will go up. So think about your processes and take that holistic view of talent acquisition. Has anyone heard the term on contingent value proposition? Do you know what I mean by that? Can you imagine? Okay, Dan, go ahead. Yeah. Absolutely right. Absolutely. Exactly. There is something, you may not even have it written down, but you have a culture, you have contingent workers, and you have a value proposition. What's in it for me when I'm working at your company as a contingent worker? And what experience am I going to take away from that? And guess what? I'm going to tell my friends. So make sure that you think about this just as much as you are thinking about your regular employer value proposition, right? It's just as important to your brand. If contingent workers are showing higher levels of churn within your workforce, that news will spread faster, right? Yeah. I used to love looking at that when I was a former civil servant, looking at IR 35, because just looking at the forums and seeing what people are saying about which ones are more friendly than others. And, by the way, HMRC is looking at those forums too. It was really quite interesting. But people do say an awful lot about what it's like to work at your company. And if you're only looking at the employer value proposition, you're missing a trick. So other things on the contingent value proposition I would want to say is make sure that you're thinking about hybrid working and remote working, location flexible working. I know you're thinking about it for your permanent workforce, but you could think about it for your contingent workforce. The one caveat I would consider particularly on really location flexible working, yes, you could send me to, Jamaica to go work, which is fine as long as I'm on the right pay and tax. Certain people you shouldn't send. Procurement, sales, anybody ability to write contracts, sign contracts. Does anyone know why? There is something in tax legislation called a permanent establishment. So it's one thing if I go to Jamaica, I set up on the beach, and I'm a great worker, and yes, I'm paying all the equivalent PAYE taxes to Jamaica and everything's fine, right? If I have the ability to sign contracts for your company, that actually means that I've created a permanent establishment of your company, and I could have made it in Jamaica, and now I could be liable, my company could be liable for corporation tax. So think about the kind of roles that you would want to allow to work overseas. But again, in your contingent value proposition, remember hybrid working, remote working, location flexible, all those kinds of things that you would think about for your permanent workforce. Breaking down silos in HR and procurement, again, total talent management does feature. It's really common for me to get a workforce profile. I will see lots of long-term workers. Many of them have been imposed on contingent labor contracts more than 2 years. I see a lot of nominated workers. Some people call them payrollees. And by that, it's where I know someone and I say, Dan, I want to hire you. I'm just going to put you on the payroll here as a contingent worker. I've seen companies have 50% of their contingent workforce made up of these nominated workers where the agency hasn't done any work to find them, right? It's an awful lot. It's not the best thing for diversity. It means you're hiring in the people you know and all that kind of stuff. So if you do bring competition into that, that certainly helps on that side. I see a lot on IT in contingent programs. Usually 50% of the big companies are spending tremendous amounts in IT contingent labor. And I do question, what's your employer value proposition versus your contingent value proposition? And are you making it more attractive inadvertently to work one area versus the other? And there's even things like where you have areas labeled difficult to recruit. If you're all talent acquisition professionals, it's really hard to recruit. Really hard to recruit. Well, if you can recruit them on the contingent side with no problem because your wages are higher, you've got a mismatch in the market and your offering is not right. So, think about those things. And be realistic on cost savings. I say this again, as a procurement person, and they all think that we're bean counters trying to save every single penny. I actually do not care if they've squeezed the markup so much, but you can't recruit. That's a huge problem for companies because you do need to have the talent in place to deliver on your overall business strategy. So don't squeeze it so much that people don't want to work with you on an individual recruiter basis. So we are seeing more market mature programs out there, And that's okay. It's okay. Some companies are looking at moving this kind of management in-house. We can do it themselves. Reasons for doing this would be more cost and control, or even they're a destination outsourcer. I used to work for Accenture, and they think, well, people outsource to us. Why would we outsource the management of our contingent workforce somewhere else? So yeah, there is an investment in it, in fixed headcount costs, but that would be it. So if you're one of the smart companies, think about this, and you will be forward thinking for your contingent labor programs. So that is really what I wanted to say. Does anyone have any questions?